The blood came first, dark rivulets streaking down Sally Bullock's temple, mixing with sweat and the red dust of the Kimberly. She didn't remember falling. One moment she'd been scrambling over the rocky escarpment, camera bag swinging wildly from her shoulder, chasing the perfect sunset shot over the gorge. The next, her boot caught on a root twisted like a snake, and gravity claimed her. Now she lay crumpled against the ghost gum, her left leg bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. The pain hadn't hit yet, just a strange numbness and the copper taste of shock in her mouth. Above her, the canopy swayed in the late afternoon heat, eucalyptus leaves clicking like whispered warnings. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a rasp. The tour group would be kilometers away by now, heading back to base camp. They wouldn't notice she was missing until sundown, maybe longer. That's when she heard it. The soft thump-thump of feet hitting earth. Not human feet. Something heavier. Something watching from the shadows of the paper bark trees, where the light didn't reach and the air tasted of old rain and ancient stone. Sally's vision blurred. The forest tilted, and as consciousness slipped away like water through her fingers, she saw two shapes emerge from the undergrowth, one rust-red and impossibly tall, the other lean and golden, with eyes that burned like amber in the dying light. Then everything went black. What Sally didn't know yet was that those two shadows would become her only chance to survive the Kimberly. If you love true-style survival stories with unexpected twists, subscribe and settle in, because what happens next is something no one will believe. If it hadn't really happened, Sally Bullock had no idea that she was about to become part of something impossible, something that science can't explain. If you want to witness one of the most incredible survival stories ever told, you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell icon too, because stories like this don't come around often. Now, let's see what happens when Sally opens her eyes. Sally woke to the sensation of warm breath on her face. Not the sterile air of a hospital or the musty cabin smell of the tour van, but the humid, earthy exhale of something alive and wild. Her eyes snapped open, and she found herself staring into the face of a red kangaroo, its dark eyes studying her with an intelligence that seemed almost human. She should have screamed, should have scrambled backward, injured leg be damned. But something in the creature's gaze held her still, a kind of gentle curiosity, a question being asked without words. The kangaroo sat back on its haunches, massive hind legs tucked beneath its body, tail thick as a man's arm stretched behind it for balance. It was easily 6 feet tall, its rust color for catching the last rays of sunlight that filtered through the canopy. A male, Sally's photographer's mind noted automatically. A big one. Then she saw the second animal. The dingo circled slowly to her left, keeping distance but never taking its eyes off her. It was smaller than she'd expected, more fox than wolf, with a cream-colored coat that darkened to gold along its shoulders and a white-tipped tail that swayed like a pendulum. Its ears were pricked forward, alert, and its amber eyes held the same strange awareness as the kangaroo's. Sally's heart hammered against her ribs. Dingoes were predators. Kangaroos were prey. They shouldn't be together. Shouldn't be this close. Shouldn't be watching her like they were waiting for something. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, I'm hurt. I need help." The kangaroo's ears twitched. The dingo sat down, tongue lolling out in what looked absurdly like a grin. And then, to Sally's utter bewilderment, the kangaroo leaned forward and began to nudge her camera bag toward her with its nose. Sally's hands trembled as she unzipped the bag. Everything was still there. The Nikon, the lenses, the emergency kit she'd almost left behind that morning. The emergency kit. Her fingers fumbled with the zipper of the small red pouch, pulling out antiseptic wipes, gauze, and a small bottle of painkillers. The kangaroo watched intently as she cleaned the gash on her forehead, wincing as the alcohol burned. The dingo had moved closer now, close enough that Sally could see the individual whiskers on its muzzle, the slight grain around its eyes that suggested it wasn't young. When she reached for her leg, tried to assess the damage, the kangaroo made a low sound, something between a cough and a grunt. Sally froze. The big male shifted his weight, then carefully, impossibly carefully, placed one massive paw on her shoulder. Not pushing, not threatening. Just holding her still. What are you? The dingo moved then, lightning fast, disappearing into the undergrowth. Sally's breath caught. Abandoned. They were leaving her. But then the dingo returned, dragging something in its jaws. A thick branch, nearly straight, stripped of its smaller offshoots. The kangaroo released her shoulder and took the branch in its forepaws, holding it against Sally's injured leg. Understanding crashed over her like a wave. They wanted her to splint it, with shaking hands and tears streaming down her face, from pain, from fear, from the sheer impossibility of what was happening. Sally bound her leg to the branch using strips torn from her shirt. The animals watched every movement, the kangaroo occasionally adjusting the branch when her angle was wrong, the dingo sitting guard at the perimeter, ears swiveling to catch every sound in the darkening forest. When she finished, the kangaroo made that sound again, softer this time, almost approving. Then it stood, towering over her, and looked toward the east where the first stars were beginning to prick through the purple sky. The dingo whined, low and urgent. Night was coming to the Australian bush, and Sally Bullock was about to learn that in this forest, after dark, the real dangers emerged. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared. Sally's thin hiking shirt, already torn for splint, offered little protection against the chill that rose from the forest floor. She hugged her knees to her chest, injured legs stretched awkwardly in front of her, trying to conserve heat. The kangaroo had moved away, but only a few meters, positioning itself between Sally and the dense scrub to the south. The dingo paced in a slow circle, nose to the ground, then to the air, reading messages Sally couldn't begin to interpret. She tried her phone again. No signal. The battery was at 15%. She'd used most of it taking photos earlier, chasing that perfect shot that had led her away from the group, up that rocky slope, to the fall that had changed everything. A branch snapped in the darkness. The dingo's head whipped around, lips pulling back to reveal teeth that gleamed white in the rising moonlight. The kangaroo stood tall, balanced on its tail, powerful legs cocked and ready. Sally's blood turned to ice. Another snap, closer. Then she heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. Not a dingo's growl. Something bigger. Something that made every prey instinct in Sally's DNA scream at her to run. The dingo moved first, positioning itself directly in front of Sally, hackles raised in a ridge along its spine. The kangaroo shifted, angling its body to create a wall. Together, they formed a barrier between Sally and whatever was circling in the dark. The growl came again, and this time Sally saw the eyes, two pale green orbs reflecting the moonlight, set low to the ground. A feral dog, she thought, or another dingo. But the kangaroo's reaction suggested something worse. The standoff lasted an eternity. Sally barely breathed, her hand gripping a rock she'd found by her side. Pathetic defense against a predator, but all she had. The dingo's growl built in its throat, a sound that spoke a territory and pack, and a willingness to die defending both. Then, without warning, the kangaroo exploded forward. Not hopping, launching. Its powerful legs drove it toward the eyes in the darkness, and Sally heard the impact of flesh on flesh, a surprised yelp, and the crash of something large retreating through the undergrowth at speed. The dingo chased after it, barking sharp warnings into the night. Then silence. Sally waited, heart thundering, rock still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. 1 minute passed. 2. 5. The dingo returned first, trotting back into the small clearing with what looked like satisfaction in its gait. The kangaroo followed, uninjured but breathing hard, its chest rising and falling like bellows. They had protected her, actually protected her. Why? Sally whispered into darkness. Why are you helping me? Neither animal answered, But as the dingo curled up beside her, close enough that she could feel its warmth, and the kangaroo resumed its watchful position, Sally felt something shift in her chest. They weren't just helping her. They were keeping her alive. Dawn came slowly, painting the canopy in shades of gold and pink. Sally woke to find the dingo gone, and the kangaroo standing over her, nudging her shoulder with its nose. When she didn't move fast enough, it nudged harder, more insistent. "I can't walk," she said, gesturing to her leg. "I can barely move." The kangaroo made a sound she was beginning to recognize as disagreement. It moved around behind her and, before Sally could protest, hooked its forepaws under her armpits and lifted. The pain was immediate and blinding. Sally cried out, but the kangaroo didn't stop. With strength that seemed impossible for any animal, it hauled her upright, supporting most of her weight while she balanced on her good leg. The makeshift splint held, barely. The dingo reappeared, carrying something in its mouth. Berries, small, red, clustered on a broken branch. It dropped them at Sally's feet and sat back, waiting. "You can't be serious," Sally said. "I don't even know if these are safe to eat." The dingo picked up one berry and ate it, chewing deliberately, maintaining eye contact. Then it pushed the branch closer with its nose. Sally's stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten since breakfast yesterday, and that had been just coffee and a granola bar. With shaking hands, she picked up a berry and put it in her mouth. It burst tart and sweet on her tongue, and she nearly sobbed with relief. While she ate, the kangaroo released her and began to move northeast, pausing every few meters to look back. The message was clear: time to go. Go where? Sally asked, but she already knew the answer. Away from here. Toward help. Toward civilization. Or so she hoped, using the kangaroo for support and a thick branch the dingo found as a crutch. Sally began to hobble through the forest. It was agony. Every step sent lightning bolts of pain through her leg, and after 20 minutes, she was drenched in sweat despite the morning cool. But the animals kept her moving, the kangaroo adjusting its pace to match hers, the dingo scouting ahead and returning to guide them around obstacles. They moved through landscapes Sally had only seen in documentaries. Towering ghost gums with bark peeling like old paper, rocky outcrops that seemed to glow red in the morning light, and creeks so clear she could count the stones on the bottom. The dingo led her to water twice, waiting patiently while she drank and refilled her small bottle. The kangaroo found shade during the hottest part of the day, forcing her to rest even when panic urged her to keep moving. Hours blurred together. The pain became a constant companion, a white noise that Sally learned to push to the back of her mind. She focused instead on the animals, on the way the kangaroo's ears swiveled independently, tracking sounds she couldn't hear, on how the dingo's tail communicated mood and direction with the slightest shift. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Sally realized they'd covered what must be several kilometers. Her good leg trembled with exhaustion, and the splinted one had gone mercifully numb. They were ascending now, following the dingo up a gradual slope toward a rocky outcrop. When they reached the top, Sally's breath caught. Spread below them was a valley she didn't recognize, bisected by a river that snaked through the landscape like a silver ribbon. And there, on the far side of the river, something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Smoke. A thin column rising from what had to be a campfire. People. Salvation. But the kangaroo was staring at the smoke with what Sally could only describe as concern. And the dingo had started to whine, high and anxious, backing away from the overlook. Something was wrong. They didn't want her to go toward the smoke. Sally realized this when she started down the slope, and the kangaroo physically blocked her path, its body a immovable wall. The dingo circled behind her, herding her back, teeth gently catching the hem of her pants when she tried to sidestep. "Are you crazy?" Sally's voice cracked with frustration and fear. That's people. That's help. I need a doctor. The kangaroo shook its head. Actually shook its head like a human saying no. I don't understand, Sally sobbed. Please, I don't understand. The dingo barked sharply, then took off down the slope in a different direction, angling away from the smoke toward the south. The kangaroo waited, watching Sally with those impossibly intelligent eyes. Every instinct screamed at her to head for that campfire. People meant rescue. People meant hospitals and pain medication and safety. The animals had helped her, yes, but they were still animals. They couldn't understand what she needed. Could they? Sally looked at the kangaroo. Really looked. At the scars on its chest and flank. Old wounds from fights or predators. At the way it held itself protective and sure. At the pleading in its gaze that said, "Trust me." She thought about the night before, how they'd driven off the predator, how they'd found her food and water, how the kangaroo had supported her weight for hours without complaint, and the dingo had scouted every step of their path. Why would they save her just to lead her into danger now? "Okay," Sally whispered. "Okay, I'll follow." The kangaroo visibly relaxed. It moved beside her, offering its shoulder, and together they began to descend the slope away from the smoke. They'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Sally heard the voices, men's voices, rough, laughing, coming from the direction of the campfire, and then the gunshot. Sally ducked instinctively, the crack echoing off the rocks. The dingo was already racing back toward them, and the kangaroo pushed Sally down behind a boulder. They all crouched there, breathing hard, as the voices grew closer. "Told you I saw something up on the ridge." "Probably just their roommate. They're everywhere." "No, bigger than that. Could be that Sheila from the tour group, the one they're looking for." Sally's blood ran cold. They knew she was missing. But something in the way they talked, the casual cruelty in their laughter, the eager edge to their words, made her skin crawl. "Reward's $5,000 if we find her alive." Who says we have to find her alive? Could say, "She was already dead when we got here." The other voice laughed. Split the reward with fewer people asking questions. Smart. Sally pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. These weren't rescuers. They were opportunists at best, murderers at worst. If the animals hadn't stopped her, if she'd gone straight to that campfire, the kangaroo was watching her face, reading her realization. It touched its nose to her forehead. So gentle, so deliberate, and in that moment, Sally understood. They hadn't saved her for no reason. They were still saving her. The voices passed by their hiding spot, moving back toward the smoke. The dingo waited until they were distant specks before emerging, and then led Sally on a path that took them wide around the valley, away from danger, away from betrayal disguised as rescue. As they walked into the gathering dusk, Sally reached out and touched the kangaroo's flank. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for knowing." The animals didn't respond, but they stayed close as the last light faded and the stars emerged overhead. 3 unlikely companions bound by something deeper than species, deeper than instinct, bound by trust. The second night was worse than the first. Sally's leg had begun to swell, despite the splint, the skin tight and hot to the touch. Fever crept through her body, turning the world strange and wavy at the edges. She knew these signs. Infection setting in, her body fighting a battle it might not win without antibiotics. The animals seemed to sense it too. The dingo pressed closer than before, sharing its warmth as chills racked Sally's frame. The kangaroo kept watch but frequently returned to check on her, its nose testing her forehead, reading the heat there with growing agitation. Around midnight, Sally started to drift. Not sleep exactly. Something stranger. A half-conscious state where the boundary between reality and dream blurred like watercolors in rain. She saw her apartment in Sydney, her sister's wedding last spring, her father teaching her to use her first camera when she was 8 years old, The memories felt more real than the forest floor beneath her. Then the hallucinations began. She saw the kangaroo standing upright like a man, speaking in a language she almost understood. The dingo transformed into her childhood dog, Max, who died when Sally was 12. They were trying to tell her something important, something she needed to know, but the words kept slipping away like smoke. "I'm dying," Sally heard herself say. "I'm dying out here." The kangaroo's response cut through the fever haze, a sound so loud, so insistent, that it dragged Sally partway back to reality. The animal was calling, its voice carrying through the forest in a series of coughing barks that echoed off the rocks and trees. The dingo joined in, howling into the night. Not the haunting calls Sally had heard in documentaries, but something sharper, more urgent, a distress signal. Through her blurred vision, Sally saw shapes emerging from the darkness. More kangaroos, 4, 5, 6 of them, appearing from the scrub like ghosts. And other dingoes, slinking low to ground, eyes glowing amber in the moonlight. The animals were calling for help, but not for her. Sally watched, consciousness fading in and out, as the newcomers approached the big red kangaroo and the golden dingo. There was communication happening, complex, nuanced, beyond anything Sally had learned about animal behavior in her nature photography courses. The other kangaroos touched noses with their protector, their ears moving in patterns that seemed almost like speech. The dingoes circled and sniffed, exchanging information in ways Sally couldn't begin to comprehend. Then, as suddenly as they'd arrived, the new animals dispersed into forest, moving with purpose in different directions. Sally tried to ask what was happening, but her tongue felt thick and useless. The fever was winning. She knew that, knew she might not see morning. But somehow, impossibly, she wasn't afraid anymore. The kangaroo settled beside her, its massive body a wall of warmth. The dingo curled against her other side, its heartbeat steady and sure against her ribs. If she was going to die in the Australian bush, at least she wouldn't die alone. At least she'd die knowing that kindness existed in forms she'd never expected. Sally closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. She woke to bird song and the sensation of something cool and wet being pressed against her forehead. Sally's eyes fluttered open to find the dingo standing over her, a soaked piece of bark in its jaws. It had been bringing her water, she realized, carrying it from some nearby source and pressing it against her skin to bring down the fever. But that wasn't all. Scattered around her were things that hadn't been there before, leaves with sharp, medicinal smell that the kangaroo was methodically chewing into a pulp, roots that the dingo had dug up, still clotted with dark earth, even a section of honeycomb, broken and dripping, propped against a rock. The other animals had brought medicine. Sally's scientific mind struggled to process it. Kangaroos didn't practice herbal healing. Dingoes didn't forage for medicinal plants. And yet the evidence was all around her. A primitive pharmacy assembled by creatures that supposedly operated only on instinct. The kangaroo approached with a wad of chewed leaves in its mouth and paused, waiting. Sally understood. She opened her mouth, and the kangaroo carefully deposited the pulp onto her tongue. It was bitter, astringent, making her eyes water. But Sally forced herself to swallow, trusting these animals who had already saved her life multiple times. The dingo brought her honey next, which helped cut the bitterness, and then more water carried in bark vessels. Over the next hours, Sally felt the fever begin to break. The chills subsided. The fog in her mind lifted degree by degree. When she finally sat up without dizziness, the kangaroo made a sound she was beginning to recognize as approval. They stayed there through the day while Sally recovered, the animals taking turns keeping watch and bringing her food. More berries, some kind of tuber the dingo unearthed that was surprisingly sweet when raw, even a fat grub that the kangaroo insisted she eat despite her disgust. Protein, her rational mind supplied. She needed protein. By evening, Sally could stand with support. By nightfall, she could take several steps unaided before the pain forced her to stop. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The kangaroo seemed to think so too. as the stars emerged overhead. It moved to the eastern edge of their clearing and looked back at Sally, ears forward, waiting. The dingo woofed softly and picked up Sally's camera bag in its mouth. They were moving again, and this time, Sally thought she understood why. Those men with guns were still out there. The infection might return. Every hour she stayed in the forest was another hour closer to death. But now, for the first time since the fall, Sally believed she might actually make out alive, because she wasn't alone. And these animals, these impossible, intelligent, inexplicably compassionate creatures, weren't going to let her die, not if they could help it. The river appeared on the third day, not the one Sally had seen from the ridge, near the dangerous campfire. This was wider, faster, cutting through a gorge lined with ancient rock formations that glowed orange in the afternoon sun. The water churned white over boulders, and the sound of it was like thunder. Sally's heart sank. She could barely walk. How was she supposed to cross that? But the kangaroo was already moving downstream, the dingo trotting along the bank with its nose to the ground. Sally followed as best she could, leaning heavily on her branch crutch, until they reached a spot where the river widened and calmed, flowing slower over a bed of stones. A ford. The animals had found a ford. The kangaroo entered the water first, testing the depth and current. It was chest deep on the big male, which meant it would be over Sally's head in places. The dingo whined, pacing along the bank, clearly unhappy about the crossing. Sally shared its concern. Even with the splint, her injured leg wouldn't provide much help with balance. One wrong step, one slip on the slick rocks, and the current would take her. But on the far bank, she could see a cleared area through the trees. A trail, maybe a logging road. Something man-made that might lead to actual civilization. The kangaroo emerged from the river and shook itself, water spraying in the sunlight. It looked at Sally with an expression that clearly said, "Your turn." "I can't do this," Sally said. "I'll fall. I'll—" The kangaroo cut her off with a sharp bark and moved back into the water, positioning itself broadside to the current. The dingo barked too and splashed in on the upstream side, smaller but no less determined. They were creating a barrier, a living wall to break the current and give her a path. Sally felt tears prick her eyes for what must have been the 100th time since the fall. These animals, these wild, supposedly simple creatures, were risking themselves for her. Again, she stepped into the river. The water was shockingly cold, fed by mountain runoff even in the summer heat. Sally gasped as it reached her waist, the current pulling at her legs, trying to sweep her feet out from under her. But the kangaroo was there, solid and immovable, and when Sally grabbed onto its shoulder, the animal braced itself and held firm. Step by step they crossed. The dingo moved ahead, testing each foothold before letting Sally proceed. The kangaroo matched its pace to hers, never rushing, never faltering even when the current strengthened in the deeper sections. Twice Sally's injured leg buckled, and she would have gone under, but both times the kangaroo caught her, its massive strength keeping her upright. The crossing took forever. The crossing took seconds. Time lost meaning in the roar of water, and the desperate focus required for each step. And then Sally's good foot found purchase on the far bank, and she was pulling herself up on the dry land, sobbing and shaking but alive. The animals emerged behind her, the dingo shaking itself vigorously, the kangaroo simply standing in the shallows for a moment as if gathering strength. Sally wanted to collapse, wanted to lie down on the warm rocks and never move again. But the kangaroo was already heading toward the cleared area she'd spotted, and the dingo was collecting her camera bag where she dropped it. They'd crossed the river. But they weren't done yet. Through the trees ahead, Sally could hear a sound that made her heart leap, the distant rumble of an engine. A road. There was a road. The road was real, a rough dirt track carved through the bush, probably used by rangers or mining vehicles. Sally stood at the edge of it, swaying on her feet, hardly believing what she was seeing. In the distance, dust rose from an approaching vehicle. Rescue. Finally, she turned to the kangaroo and the dingo, ready to thank them, ready to somehow make them understand what they'd done for her. But both animals were backing away, retreating into the forest shadows. "Wait," Sally called. "Don't go. Please. I need to. I need you to be here when help comes. So they'll know. So I can tell them what you did." The kangaroo stopped. It looked at Sally for a long moment, and in its eyes she saw something that made her chest tighten. Sadness, understanding, and farewell. The dingo whined and approached one last time, pressing its head against Sally's good leg. She reached down to stroke its fur, feeling the wild heartbeat beneath her palm. Then both animals turned and vanished into the undergrowth, leaving Sally alone on the road. The vehicle rounded the bend, a park ranger's truck. It screeched to a halt when the driver saw her, and suddenly there were people surrounding her, voices asking questions, hands supporting her as her legs finally gave out. "We've been searching for 3 days," the ranger said, his face showing shock at her condition. "How did you make it this far? How did you survive?" Sally opened her mouth to answer, to tell them about the kangaroo and the dingo, about the medicine and the river crossing, and the way they protected her from those men. But the words died in her throat, because behind the ranger, stepping out of a second vehicle that had pulled up, were 2 men she recognized, the ones from the campfire, the ones who'd talked about finding her already dead. They saw her. Recognition flashed across their faces, followed immediately by masks of concern. "Thank God," one of them said, moving forward. "We've been out here with the search party. We were so worried." The ranger nodded. "These volunteers have been helping since you were reported missing. Real community spirit." Sally's blood turned to ice. If she told the truth, if she mentioned overhearing them, it would be her word against theirs. 2 upstanding volunteers against one injured, delirious woman who just survived 3 days in the bush. Who would believe that a kangaroo and a dingo had saved her? Who would believe anything she said? And if they thought she could identify them, what would they do? Sally met the eyes of the false volunteer, saw the calculation there, the threat. "I don't remember much," she heard herself say. I think I've been unconscious most of the time." The man's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. He smiled. "Head injuries will do that. Lucky we found you." As they loaded Sally into the truck, she looked back at the forest one last time. Just for a moment, she saw them, 2 shadows watching from between the trees. The kangaroo's rust-red coat caught a shaft of sunlight. The dingo's amber eyes gleamed with intelligence that transcended species. They had known. Even before they saved her, they had known she would have to keep their secret, because the truth was too strange, too impossible, because sometimes the wild understands human nature better than humans do themselves. Sally raised her hand in a small wave, a gesture of goodbye and gratitude that only the animals would see. The ranger started the truck, and they pulled away down the dirt road. Sally didn't look back again, but she could feel them watching until she disappeared around the bend. 2 guardians returning to a forest that held more mysteries than anyone would ever believe. 6 months later, Sally Bullock returned to the Kimberly with her camera. The doctors had been amazed by her recovery. The splint had been expertly applied. They said, better than some field medics could do. The infection had been minor, treated with some kind of natural antiseptic that they couldn't quite identify from the residue in her wound. She'd been dehydrated, but not dangerously so, malnourished, but with adequate protein levels that suggested she'd been eating regularly. "You're lucky," they kept saying. "Very lucky." Lucky. Yes. The tour company had given her a full refund and an apology. The 2 volunteers had been lauded for their search efforts. Sally had smiled and thanked them while her skin crawled, knowing what they'd really been doing in that forest. But she'd learned to live with the lie, because the truth was more important than justice. She found them at dawn on her second day back, the kangaroo and the dingo, standing together at the edge of a clearing as the sun painted the sky gold and pink. They saw her and didn't run. The kangaroo's ears came forward in recognition. The dingo's tail wagged once, twice. Sally raised her camera, framing the shot. Two animals that shouldn't be allies, standing side by side in the soft light, looking back at her with eyes that held secrets the world would never know. She pressed the shutter. Click. And in that moment, Sally understood the final truth, the one that would stay with her long after the scars faded and the nightmare stopped. She hadn't just been saved by a kangaroo and a dingo. She'd been chosen. Chosen to witness something that existed beyond scientific understanding, beyond the neat categories humans use to explain the natural world. Chosen to carry a secret that would sound like madness if spoken aloud, but felt like grace when held close to the heart. As Sally packed up her camera and headed back toward base camp, she noticed something that made her stop. Fresh tracks in the soft earth, leading away into the forest. Kangaroo prints and dingo prints side by side. And next to them, barely visible in the dawn light, were human footprints. Not hers. She hadn't walked this path. Someone else. Someone who'd been following the same trail, moving with the same companions. Sally's breath caught as understanding bloomed. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. The forest had its guardians, and they chose who to save. Sally smiled, shouldered her camera bag, and walked back toward the world of roads and phones and explanations that would never be enough. But she carried the truth with her, wild and impossible and absolutely real. Some stories, she'd learned, are too important to tell. Some secrets are too sacred to share. And some bonds transcend species, transcend logic, transcend everything we think we know about the world. In the Kimberly forest, where the eucalyptus trees click their ancient warnings and the red dust holds a memory of countless footprints, the animals still watch, still wait, still choose. And somewhere out there, another lost soul is stumbling through the undergrowth, falling, failing, about to discover that mercy comes in forms we never expect, about to learn that in the thick forest, when all seems lost, salvation doesn't always arrive on two legs. Sometimes it arrives on four.
Subscribe if the story reminded you that kindness still exists. Like and share if you believe the world needs more stories like Sally's. Comment and tell me about a time when help came from an unexpected place. Because that's what this channel is about. Reminding you that mercy is real, that connection is possible, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the wild things understand us better than we understand ourselves. Sally made it home, but her guardians are still out there, still watching, still choosing who to save next. Maybe one day it will be you.